has written a couple of books on usability, and he's here today to talk to you about the 7 deadly sins of user research. Can we please give a big round of applause to David Travis?
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me at the back? Good. I'm David Travis, and let's have a quick show of hands. What I'd like you to do is raise your hand if you work for an organisation that would claim to design easy-to-use products and services. Okay. Well, a mixed response, really. That's a bit sad, isn't it? Interestingly, let's try the question from the other direction. If I asked you to raise your hand if you think most of the technology that you use at the moment is easy to use, and by technology I mean things like websites, handheld gadgets, smartphone apps and so on. Raise your hand if you think most of those are easy to use. Well, certainly fewer at least. And it's an interesting distinction, isn't it, really? It's interesting that we've got this divide between what companies think of their products and services and what most users think. And in my job, I work with organisations to try and bridge that divide. I do it by showing them how their customers actually use their products and services. The short story is, it's not very pretty. And sometimes I feel like a counsellor working with a divorcing couple. If only users would shut up and read the manual. Just click here, stupid. But there's an obvious reason for this disconnect between what organisations think users want and what users actually want. But like all obvious reasons, it's wrong. And the obvious reason would be for me to exhort you to do more user research. Now, you'll be pleased to know I'm not going to exhort you to do that. Well, actually, I will do more user research. It's the right thing to do. But it's not about the quantity of user research, because firms already do loads of user research. Surveys, focus groups, usability tests abound. The problem isn't with the quantity of user research that's happening. The problem is with the quality of user research. Organisations struggle to distinguish good user research from bad user research. Now, here's my definition of good user research. Good user research is research that gives us actionable and testable insights into users' needs. And today I'm going to share with you 7 common blockers that prevent organisations from doing user research well. And here's how I'm going to do it. I'm going to review what I've jokingly called the 7 deadly sins of user research. Personally, I like talks like this that have this kind of structure, because then I know when the speaker's getting close to the end. As I go through this list, here's what I'd like you to do. Treat it a bit like goal of the month. I'd like you to pick one favourite. Choose one that you think is most relevant to your organisation and make a pledge that when you work tomorrow, you're going to work on that particular issue. I don't expect you to remember all 7 of these, but you should walk away with at least one that will make you and your organisation more effective. And as you'll see as we get towards the end of the talk, that's what's really behind a great design culture. So let's start with the first one here, credulity. Now, the dictionary tells me that credulity is a state of willingness to believe something without proper proof. And the form this takes in user research is asking users what they want and believing the answer. A couple of months ago, I was attending a usability study on behalf of a client. Now, I'm there because the client thinks that the usability tests they're running aren't delivering much predictive value. And the client was concerned they weren't recruiting the right participants, or maybe there was something wrong with the tasks they were asking people to do. And as I sat in the observation room, I watched the administrator show 3 alternative designs of a user interface to the participant and ask, which of these 3 do you prefer? Why? It seems to have lots of face validity, doesn't it? Asking people what they want is very tempting, but it makes so much sense. So it actually turns out to be the worst thing that you can do. Let's go back 40 years to explain why that's the case. Nearly 40 years ago, psychologists Richard Nisbett and Timothy Wilson carried out some research outside a bargain store in Ann Arbor in Michigan. And the researchers set a table up outside the store with a sign that read, "Consumer Evaluation Survey, which is the best quality?" And on the table were 4 pairs of ladies' stockings, and they labelled them A, B, C, and D. And they asked people to pick the one they felt was best. On the face of it, this is just like the usability test that I observed, but there's a twist. All pairs of stockings are identical. It turned out that most people preferred D, 40%, and fewer preferred A. But when they asked people why did they prefer D, they came up with some interesting answers, even though, remember, they're exactly the same. The fact is, the psychologists knew something that the participants didn't. What they knew was that there's a natural bias when we see a sequence of things in a line to pick the one on the right-hand side. But nobody said that was the reason they picked the one on the right-hand side. Instead, they would come up with answers why. They would say things, for example, the elasticity of this pair is much better, or they would say these are sheerer, or they would say it's just the way they glisten in the light, I don't know. What's interesting about this is there's an invisible thread joining that Nisbet and Wilson study to the usability test I observed. And the reason I call the thread invisible is because few user researchers appear to be aware of it, despite the fact there's a whole sub-discipline of psychology called prospect theory devoted to it, that Daniel Kahneman won a Nobel Prize for his work in the area. The fact is, people don't have reliable insight into their mental processes, so there's no point asking them what they want. In fact, this leads me to the first rule of finding out what people want, and it's this. It's like Fight Club. The first rule of finding out what people want is don't ask people what they want. This quotation from Rob Fitzpatrick catches it perfectly, I think, where he says, trying to learn from customer conversations is like excavating a delicate archaeological site. The truth is down there somewhere, but it's fragile. While each blow with your shovel gets you closer to the truth, you're liable to smash it into a million pieces if you use too blunt an instrument. How can we overcome this problem? So remember, my definition of successful user research is research that gives us actionable and testable insights into users' needs. It's no good asking users what they like or what they dislike, what they would do in the future, or asking them what other people would do. So the best way of achieving this isn't to ask. It's actually to observe. And your aim is to observe for long enough that you can make a kind of a reasonable guess about what's going on. So asking direct questions is going to encourage confabulation. It's not going to tell you what's actually going on. And there are two ways you can observe. The first way is you can go to people's context and look at the way they're doing the thing at the moment. Observe the way they currently solve the task that your system or product is aiming to solve. And the second way you can resolve this issue is to actually teleport people to the future. And I'm not saying that facetiously. You can do that with prototypes and simulations where you create the context where what it will be like in the future and you put people there. The key point is what people say and is much less useful than what people actually do. People are unreliable witnesses. Let's move to this second sin of dogmatism. And this is the tendency to lay down principles as undeniably true without consideration of evidence or the opinion of others. And the form this takes in user research is believing that there's one right way to do user research. Now, I'm sure we've all worked with clients who think that a survey is the right way to understand user needs. Perhaps because we hear about surveys every day in the news, or like this, you get them sent to you by email. People tend to think of them as being more reliable or more useful. So here are some that I found in my junk mail folder, and I'm sure if you did a search, you'd find an equal number as well. The notion of using an alternative method, like a site visit or a customer interview, doesn't have the same face validity because the sample size is comparatively small. But sadly, having a large number of respondents in a survey is not going to help you if you don't know the right questions to ask. And that's where site visits and customer interviews come in. But site visits and customer interviews, they're not the whole solution either. Although they're a great way to get insights into your users' needs, goals, and behavior, they shouldn't be the only method that you use. Recently, I worked with a user researcher who seemed to think there was no room for any other research method than the customer interview. So we wanted to validate some personas, and she felt we should run more customer interviews. We wanted to identify the top tasks. She felt we should run more customer interviews. We wanted to compare two alternative landing page designs. The solution, she felt, was to run more customer interviews. Now, that kind of dogmatism is unhelpful. Site visits and customer interviews give you signposts. They don't give you definitive answers. It's kind of broad brush stuff, a bit like the weather forecast. There may be some patterns in the data, but these aren't as useful as the conversation that you have with people when you're carrying out these interviews and the things you observe them do. And that's because the gap between what people say and what people do is often a design opportunity. But there comes a point where you need to validate your findings, and you do that with site visits and customer interviews by using a different kind of technique. You might choose a survey, for example, to validate your personas, or you might choose multivariate A/B testing in order to compare a couple of different landing pages. And that brings me to this notion of triangulation. So triangulation is where you combine methodologies in the study of the same phenomenon. Quantitative data tells us what people are doing, and qualitative data tells us why people are doing it. And with user research, it's best to have a combination of both quantitative and qualitative data, because combining the two can be really quite powerful. For example, you can generate insights from your observations that you can then follow up with analytical data, like site analytics. Or you can start with the quantitative data that you have about users and then ask, where do you need more depth and more exploratory data? As an analogy, it's a bit like a movie. So triangulation is like having different camera angles in a movie. So it will be hard to understand the full picture of what's going on in this still that I've taken from Psycho if every scene in the movie was shot like this, as an extreme close-up. And similarly, it will be hard to understand what's going on if every image was shot as a wide-angle view, as in this scene, this still from the same movie. You can just about see a character in this shot, but it's not clear what's happening. Unlike movies, you want your research to show the close-ups, but you also want to see the bigger picture. The third sin of user research is around the notion of bias. And again, the dictionary tells me that bias means a special influence that sways one's thinking, especially in a way considered to be unfair. And user research is a continual fight against bias. And really, there are three kinds of bias that matter in user research. The first is sampling bias, and that occurs because you don't cover all of the population that you're studying, or you cover only certain types of people because it's easier to do so. So surveys often fall into that trap. If you survey people with an online survey, you're obviously not going to get respondents who don't use the internet. And if they're an important part of your market, that means your sample is going to be biased. A second kind of bias is method bias, and that's where you collect data using just one kind of methodology and you don't triangulate. It's like I already discussed under this, the sin of dogmatism. But it's response bias that I want to discuss here, and that's caused by the way in which you collect data. For example, if you ask poor questions, you're more likely to get participants to say what you want to hear rather than getting real insights into the needs that they have. Now, usually the bias is obvious in usability tests or user research. Sometimes it's a bit more subtle. So, for example, here we've got a usability test moderator simply saying, I don't want to bias you toward liking the interface. You'd think on the face of it, that's the right kind of approach. But there's an implicit bias in this statement. What she's saying is, actually, I do want to bias you toward liking the interface. So clearly what she should be saying here is, I don't want to bias you toward liking or disliking the interface. Also, questions like, do you think this is a good idea? Well, the user's got no skin in the game. It's easy for the user to say, yeah, it's a terrific idea, I'd buy 7. Or to hate the idea, it doesn't really matter as far as the user's concerned. Similarly, what would be the best way to design this? The problem with that particular question is, well, users own the problem, but you own the solution. It's not their job to come up with a solution, it's your job. That's why you're paid so much. And another example here is, it sounds like you definitely use this, wouldn't you? This sounds to me like pleading. You would absolutely use this system, wouldn't you? And Obviously, the problem with this is users will willingly give you the answer they want because users can be very polite when we want them to be, and when they're being very polite, they give you the answers you're looking for, but maybe not the answer that's important. Now, you can correct this bias by teaching people to ask the right questions. But there's an even more serious form of this bias, which is actually harder to correct. And it happens when the design team carry out research. They find that people don't really have a need for the product or service. Has it ever happened to anyone? You've carried out research and you felt, actually, nobody really wants this thing. It's tempting to hide this from senior managers because no one wants to be the purveyor of bad news. Take this particular example. It comes from MIT professor Justin Cassell, and she describes a series of focus groups that discovered that what teenage girls wanted from technology was technologically enhanced nail polish. It's amazing, isn't it? You'd never have guessed. Guess what business the firm that commissioned the research was in? It turns out the firm that commissioned the focus group research, they were in the business of making technologically enhanced nail polish. The reason this is interesting is because in Cassell's own work, with over 1,000 children in over 100 countries, where she's asked children how they would use technology to make the world a better place, not a single one of them said, you know what I need? Technologically enhanced nail polish. It never came up. If there's no need for your product, there's no point trying to convince senior managers that there is. You'll be found out in the end. It's a bad idea to cherry-pick your results to support simply what a senior manager or what a design team wants you to come back with. So you shouldn't approach user interviews with a vested interest. Your job isn't to convince people to use a service, or to get the results that management want. It's about digging for the truth, to use that Rob Fitzpatrick metaphor. Now, it doesn't mean you shouldn't have a point of view. You should have a point of view, but your point of view should be that you want the design team to understand the data. That's where you're coming from. My fourth sin is obscurantism, which is the practice, the dictionary tells me, of deliberately preventing the full details of something from becoming known. And the form this sin takes in user research is keeping the findings from research in the heads of a single person. Now, user research is often assigned to a single person on a team. You have a user researcher. It's their de facto role to go ahead and collect the data. That person becomes the spokesperson for the user's needs, the team's expert on users. Now, those of you with long memories might remember this kind of idea from Print2. Has anybody worked on projects where they used Print2? Quite a few, really. Must have been a big thing in the north at the time. And on those projects, they had a representative known as the senior user. And that person was supposed to represent user needs. And usually this senior user was an ex-user or a user's manager or someone who used to be the user in a previous life. And that person became the oracle of user needs. Basically, if that person said it was okay, then it got in the design. And that person was a bit like the precogs in Minority Report. They were meant to be able to predict the future. Now, this approach is a poor way to embed user needs, not just because, obviously, it's very difficult for a single person to understand everything that users want, but it fails because it encourages the design team to delegate all responsibility for understanding users to a single person. If the senior user says it's okay, then it gets in the design. If not, we fix it according to the comments of the senior user. And it's a cop-out because it puts a barrier between the design team and end users. Now, I hope I'm not stealing Leslie Fountain's thunder here, but the fact is user research is a team sport. And Caroline Jarrett captured it really well in this tweet. Your job as a user researcher, she says, isn't to learn about users, but to help your team learn about users. You're a facilitator as much as a researcher. You want your research findings to travel through the organization. And an even worse example is where you delegate your user research to an outside firm. When you do this, it prevents critical knowledge about users from being embedded in the organization. You really want to keep this kind of thing in-house. Just a quick footnote to this, by the way. There's some evidence that clients are getting this idea. In the last month, Adaptive Path has been acquired to act as an internal team for Capital One, and Peter Merholtz has linked the recent closure of Dan Saffer's design agency to this growth of in-house user experience teams as well. Now, I'm not saying that the industry is about to collapse, but I do think that we've reached peak agency in the UX field, and in the near future, we're going to see a trend towards companies moving their UX work increasingly in-house. Now, historically, the US UX industry is usually a couple of years ahead of where we are in the UK. So if you work for a firm that sells UX research services, you've probably got a couple of years to rethink your strategy. Okay, back to the sin and ways of getting around it. One way you can prevent this sin on your own projects is to encourage everyone on the team to get their exposure hours. So Jared Spall has introduced us to this notion of exposure hours. His research shows us that the most effective design teams spend at least 2 hours every 6 weeks observing users. For example, in field visits, usability tests would be another example. And I've recently been working with a really effective team in the Northeast, an agile team, and I've encouraged them to adopt this idea by collecting certain metrics. So that number on the right, which this thing's not showing you, but you can see it says 95, that shows the percentage of the team who've observed a user session in the last 6 weeks. And that makes sure people are getting their exposure hours. And the other metrics here show the number of users tested since inception, and that simply makes sure there's a continual focus on users. And the other number shows the days elapsed since the last usability test, and that ensures that the project's practicing iterative design. Here's another example of being able to do that within a design team. And here we've got a bunch of people who are actually planning a usability test. They're planning the research, they're going to be analysing it later as well, they're even going to be carrying it out. And this picture doesn't actually show a team of UX people, it actually shows developers, business analysts. There's some user researchers here, some designers, even the Scrum Masters involved in planning this usability test using a one-page usability test plan dashboard. How often do you see developers actually writing test tasks for usability tests or thinking about what the objectives of the usability test should be? Because what you're after doing here is trying to build a culture of user-centered design. And you do that by encouraging the whole design team to take ownership and not by putting it in the heads of a single person. But you also need to design iteratively, and that takes me to my next sin. Laziness, which is the state of being unwilling to exert oneself. And the form this takes in user research is in recycling old research data as if it's boilerplate that you can just plug into a new project that you're carrying out. I wanted to talk about one specific example here, which is to do with personas, because it kind of acts, I think, as a nice example. And I find that clients often approach the process of developing personas as a one-time activity. They'll hire an outside firm to do field research with the requisite number of users. That firm will then analyze the data, create a set of beautifully presented personas, and then give them back to the client, who then pays the invoice. Well, we already know this is a bad idea because of the sin of obscurantism. We want to keep that knowledge inside the heads of the people within the design team. We don't want it in the outside agency. But bear with me for the moment. Let's ignore that issue. But the reason I'm using personas in this example is because I'm often asked by a client, can they reuse personas that they've developed in the past? So they say they're working on a new project. It's got a passing resemblance to something they worked with previously. And they just want to, can we reuse those? Can we make some slight changes? Maybe we could give them a different name. What do you think? Would that be okay? And since they're basically their customers are essentially the same, it seems like it would be okay. But this idea so misses the point of why you develop personas that it serves as a good example. So here's a secret many people don't know. You don't need to create personas to be user-centered. This really misses the point of what personas are about, because it's not about personas. Personas don't matter. Creating personas should never be your goal. Personas are an outcome from research that you've done to get closer to users. Understanding users and user needs should be your goal. And in some ways, a set of beautifully formatted personas, like we've all seen before on projects, is simply proof, really, it should only be proof that you met with users in the same way that a selfie that you take with a celebrity proves you were at the same restaurant together. It's really about proving that you were there with the users, not that in itself isn't the goal. So the world you want to move to is one where the design team know their users so well that personas aren't needed. You don't get to this world by recycling old research. You get there by making user research part of the culture. So Eric Ries tells us that the measure of a good design team is in how quickly the team learn. It's okay for people to hate your product, well, early on anyway, but your job isn't to create a great product. What it's about is helping your user be more successful at the thing they do. It's not about your product, it's about the experience of using the product. And the purpose of multiple iterations is to find that sweet spot. Now, we've known for a long time that iterative design is the way to become user-centered. You build something, you measure its usability, you learn from it, and you redesign. Reusing old data, whether it's in the form of personas, usability tests, or field visits, isn't iterating, and it's certainly not learning. I've called this in here laziness, but it could equally be called bureaucracy or avoiding a kind of a tick box mentality, because that's the way it often exhibits itself. The great thing about iterative design is that it provides you with continual course corrections. So even if you're not doing the best user research in the world, so long as you're designing iteratively, in some ways you'll find the problems, because with the next iteration you'll see what you misunderstood from the previous work you went through. So it acts as a great course corrector. Again, to avoid this sin, you need to make user research part of the culture. So my sixth sin is vagueness, and this means not having clearly or explicitly stated or expressed goals. And in terms of user research, I see this when a team fails to focus on a single key research question and instead tries to answer several questions at once. Now, this sin's really due to the notion of laziness that I touched on before. If you do research only occasionally, you need to answer lots of questions, because they've all been shoring up all of these questions that you want to ask. And this means you end up learning a little about a lot. In fact, you can learn a lot about user research from a dishwasher. The more you cram in, the less of it gets clean. And with user research, you actually want to learn a lot about a little. And that little question is the specific question that's keeping you up at night. And to uncover this question, I asked the design team to imagine the most useful, actionable research results possible. What would those results tell us? What would we learn from that particular study? Now, everyone on the team should agree those key questions, the assumptions that you plan to test, and those top questions should be the key driver of all of the research activities that you do. And that means you need to get very specific with your research questions. If you can't articulate your research questions on a couple of small sticky notes, then it's probably much too broad. And in fact, that leads me to an interesting exercise you can do in order to uncover your focus question on projects. So sit the design team in a room and give each person a set of sticky notes and tell them to imagine we've got an all-knowing, insightful user outside the room who will answer truthfully any question we throw at them. What questions would you ask? I get the team to write a single question on a sticky note, and they can have as many sticky notes as they want. And then at the end of 5 minutes, we go to a whiteboard and we affinity sort the sticky notes, and then we dot vote on the group that's most important. And I like that idea for a couple of reasons. First of all, it gives me the overall theme we need to cover, because that's going to be the group with the most votes. But the other reason I like it is because it gives me the specific questions that we need to answer in the research session as well. We know specifically what we need to go out and get the answers to. Here's another technique you can use called the pre-mortem. I learned this idea from Gary Klein, and a pre-mortem is the hypothetical opposite of a post-mortem. And it's based on the finding that you can, if you imagine an event has already occurred, you're much better at predicting why the event occurred. So try this for yourself. So imagine a future in which the product or service that you're working on at the moment is an abject failure. I know it's not a nice thought to have, but let's go there. Go there in your head, try it now, and then ask, why was it a failure? What caused the project to fail? And you'll normally identify one or two key assumptions that you realize you haven't validated properly yet, they're the ones that you can use to drive the user research that you go out. And this approach works, I think, because it acts against the natural Pollyannism that design teams have, where they can't imagine their product or service being anything other than a wonderful success. I mean, the fact is, most products and services fail, and this makes us take that perspective. My final sin of user research is hubris. So hubris means extreme pride or self-confidence. And in user research, this takes the form of taking undue pride in your reports or in your deliverables. And all user researchers are guilty of this to some extent, but those with PhDs are the worst. And I say that with someone with a PhD. User researchers love data. When you love something, you want to share it with people. So you create detailed reports packed with graphs and quotations and screenshots and call-outs. Look at my data. Look at how wonderful my data is. A long time ago, an academic gave me some advice that stayed with me. He said, remember, you don't need to show everything that you've done. Sometimes it's like a child proudly showing a full potty to his mother. There's too much detail. I thought this gave a whole new meaning to the notion of PhD feces. Sadly, few other people are fascinated by data as you are as a user researcher. Your challenge is to turn that data into information and then turn that information into insight. Because there are a couple of problems with the excessive detail. The first problem, people don't read the report. So they turn the page, they see more data, they appreciate how clever you are, they get bored, they move on. But a more serious problem is that these kinds of reports delay the design process. I've worked in organizations where it's typical to have a week between a usability test and the final report. A week. There's no justification for that kind of delay on a project. I've been observing usability tests for about 25 years, and in virtually every usability test I've seen, we knew what the top 3 problems were once the final user left the session, sometimes before the final user had left the session. You don't need to do extensive analysis in Moray or Excel to find the top problems. Now, that analysis is useful later when you want to dig into the details, but the critical findings need to be fed back quickly. And this is so the design can be modified and so that build, measure, learn cycle can continue. Instead, you need to create information radiators to get teams understanding the data so they can take action on it. So as a general rule, if people need to turn the page, then your report's probably too long. So how can you capture the results in a single glance? So this could be a concise visual way of presenting research data, like a user journey map. And here are some examples of journey maps I've culled from a web search. If one of yours is here, thank you very much. The point I want to make here is that these are working documents. They haven't been perfectly finished. You wouldn't look at these and say, oh, they're gorgeous documents, are they? They're not meant to be gorgeous documents. They're meant to provide a quick visual summary of, in this instance, the user's journey with a product or service. Or a persona. Personas don't need to be beautiful. Think of them as design tools you can use to test your hypotheses. Or in this example of a usability dashboard from Redgate Software, what they've done here is simply listed the problems on sticky notes below the screen they apply to. At a glance, you get to see the problematic areas that need to be fixed. Clearly, that screen on the right-hand side has got some issues in this particular design. And just to show this idea of short reports can work for summative usability tests too, here's an example of a one-page usability test infographic. We didn't actually deliver this for O2. If I showed you the results for the client that we did deliver it to, I'd have to shoot you before you left the auditorium today. And although this looks a bit more swish, the report actually took about 10 minutes to produce because it's based on an Excel template where you enter the key results from the session, and hey presto, it's ready to release. There's zero delay between running the test and feeding the results back to the design team. It's a one-page PDF, it's easy to share, it has data for people who need it, and summaries for people who just want the facts. So as I've reviewed these sins, you may have noticed that many of them appear to have a common cause. The root cause is an organizational culture that can't distinguish good user research from bad user research. Companies say they value great design, but they assume that to do great design, They need a rock star designer. Great design doesn't live inside designers. Great design lives inside the heads of your users. You get inside your users' heads by doing good user research, research that provides actionable and testable insights into user needs. Good design's a symptom. It's a symptom of a culture that values user-centered design. And bad design, well, that's a symptom too. It's a symptom of an organization that can't distinguish good user research from bad user research. And perhaps that's the deadliest sin of them all. Thanks very much.